Good evening, everyone. Um, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Father John Bartholomew. Comes to us with having quite a bit of experience in this subject that he talks about today. He himself converted to Orthodoxy in Japan as a teacher of English, and couple of years later entered seminary, graduated from St. Vladimir Seminary, doing his graduate thesis on St. Nicholas of Japan. Uh, Father John is quite a student of language and also has done quite a bit of good research here on a topic of missionary activities, which I think is very pertinent to our program and to us as future pastors of the church. So without any further delay, please welcome Father John.
Thank you very much. So, when I went to college, undergraduate and graduate, I studied Asian studies. I studied Japanese and everything. But unfortunately now in my daily life, if I had to speak Japanese to a new visitor in our church, and I find Russian words coming out in the Japanese now, which I regret, but it does. Okay, let me just make a few preliminary remarks. During this presentation, I'm going to refer to St. Nicholas as St. Nicholas. I'm not going to say hire a monk, archimandrite, bishop. I'm just going to say St. Nicholas throughout the whole thing. And the other thing is we have to remember that in Japan, the family name comes first and the personal names come second. And so when I refer to Japanese people before they become Orthodox, before they're baptized, I'll do it in the Japanese order. So it says the saint and the samurai. The samurai in question was a man named Sawabe Takuma. Sawabe Takuma. Sawabe is the family name. Takuma was his first name. But when he was baptized as Pavel. And so after the baptism, I'll refer to him that way, Pavel Sawabe. And sometimes the Japanese Orthodox Christians will use both their names. For example, there's a Japanese iconographer in the 19th century who studied in Russia. Her Japanese name was Yamashita Rin, Rin being her first name. So in Japanese, she's often referred to as Irina. That was her baptismal name, Irina Yamashita Rin. So again, talking a little bit about St. Nicholas. He was born Ivan Dmitrievich Kasatkin on August 1st in 1836. He was born in a place called Beryoza village, which was in Smolensk province. I understand now that village actually does not exist anymore. It's simply not there. Although I believe a memorial cross was actually erected in the neighborhood of that village rather recently. His father was a deacon, and his mother died when he was age 6. He had one brother and one sister. And so as a young man, of course, coming from a clerical background, he entered the Smolensk seminary. And I'm not sure exactly the distance between his home and the seminary, but however long it was, he had to walk it. I mean, they did not have money for any other kind of transportation. Well, in Smolensk Seminary, he did so well, he was offered a scholarship to the St. Petersburg Theological Academy. And I should mention, I believe, I can't locate it and I can't prove it, I was told that on the iconostas at the main church of the St. Petersburg Theological Academy, there's an icon of St. Nicholas on the iconostas, which I've tried to locate and I can't. So if anybody has any ideas where I could find it, I would appreciate it. But in any case, at St. Petersburg, he did very, very well. He had a gift for languages, learned several languages. And so after his graduation, the authorities of the academy wanted him to stay on as a teacher. But when he was in the academy, he was walking along one day and he saw a notice for a consular chaplain at the Russian consulate in Hakodate, Japan. And he had read a little bit about Japan. There was a Russian naval vessel that had been marooned in Japan, so to speak, and that I can't think of the author's name right now. He wrote a book about his captivity in Japan. So St. Nicholas has a certain amount of interest. Now, there were several of the students at St. Petersburg who wanted to go to Japan, but actually what they wanted, the Russian council wanted a monk, not a married priest. And the other seminarians wanted to be married priests, so they did not want to go there as monks. So St. Nicholas, as a young man, became interested in going to Japan. Now the thing is, when he first wanted to go to Japan as a consular chaplain, the rector of the academy didn't want him to go because St. Nicholas was such a brilliant student, they thought he would kind of be lost as a chaplain to a consulate. And St. Nicholas made very clear, though, that he wasn't going there just to serve the needs of the Russian community. He was going to Japan as a missionary to convert Japan. And so that's how he got permission, both from the rector of the academy and the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg, to go there. Okay. So, I think, Doreen, I think there's a page missing here, actually. You know that, Doreen? Um, in any case, yeah, there's a page missing here. I don't know what happened to it. But, okay, so he decided to go to Japan. Now, of course, at this time, there was no Trans-Siberian Railroad. There was nothing. So he had to go from European Russia all the way to Japan, across Siberia, horses, carriages, sleds, whatever the case may be. Now, and so it was quite a long journey. Now, I'll get a little bit to the history of Japan before I go much further. But the first Russian consul in Japan was a man named Gashkevich. I mean, what do I do? Click the right one. Okay, Joseph Antonovich Gashkevich. He came from a clerical family. He had graduated, I think, from the St. Petersburg Theological Academy. But after graduation, he entered the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, whatever was the proper term for that time. He served in the Russian ecclesiastical mission in China for quite a few years before being appointed consul in Japan. And he was, again, the first Russian consul. Now, the thing is, Gushkevich didn't want simply a consular priest. He wanted somebody who would present a very, good, make a good impression about Russian Orthodoxy to the Japanese people, to themselves, and all the foreigners that were there. So he really wanted an academy graduate, well-spoken, well educated. So St. Nicholas applied to go to Japan, and he was given permission. In 1860, he was tonsured as a monk. Later in June, he was ordained to the diaconate, and then a little bit later to that, the priesthood. And this is St. Nicholas. This is St. Nicholas as a young man. Actually, I have the note here. Actually, to travel from St. Petersburg, crossing the Volga, through the Urals, through Siberia, it was a journey of 6,214 miles. And remember, no railroad at that time. Now, as he was going through Siberia, he arrived at the city of Nikolaevsk na Amuria. You have to forgive me, my Russian pronunciation is bad, so please bear with me. In Nikolaevsk, on the Amur River. And he had to winter there. In other words, the river was frozen, and so he couldn't go further than that with a ship. But at that time, Saint Innocent Veniamino, Saint Innocent, apostle to the Aleuts, and Metropolitan of Moscow, apostle to the Aleuts and Enlightened of North America, happened to be in Nikolaevsk na Amuria, and so Saint Nicholas had the opportunity to study missionary activity from one of the great missionaries in church history, Saint Innocent. But Saint Innocent was actually he was a very, very practical man. And he saw the seminarian's riasa that St. Nicholas is wearing. He said, no, I mean, you're going to Japan to represent the Russian Orthodox Church. You have to have a riasa that looks pretty good. So St. Innocent went out, bought material, and he cut the pattern for the riasa, and he gave it to St. Nicholas so he'd look good. And St. Innocent also gave him a cross that he had. Okay. So after a journey of a year from European Russia through Siberia, eventually he arrived in Japan. That's the wrong one. Okay. As you may or may not know, Japan is composed of 4 main islands. There are many thousands of little islands, but 4 main ones. This Hokkaido is the northernmost of the Japanese islands, and this is a scene of and as it says, Hakodate. Hakodate is one of the major cities in Hokkaido. So this is basically the view that St. Nicholas would have had as the ship pulled in into Hakodate. Now, I want to speak a little bit about the context of Japan. the historical context. We have to remember that Japan, for many, many centuries, 20 centuries, had nominally been under the rule of the emperor, as in a certain sense they technically are. But as a matter of fact, from the beginning, uh, I have written down 17th century, actually earlier, the feudal lords, the samurai, the warriors actually held the power. They held the real power. The emperor was there as a figurehead. Sometimes the Japanese emperor was so poor he had to actually sell his calligraphy in the street to survive. So it was it was the shogun. If you remember TV from the 1970s, which you don't look like you do actually, um, there was the movie Shogun, the miniseries Shogun, and the shogun was the military lead, the head of Japan, the effective ruler of Japan. Sometimes the shogun is translated as generalissimo. And under the shogun, there were feudal lords, which were called daimyo. And so, in other words, it was a feudalism similar to that in Europe, where you'd have the leader on top and he would parcel out the lands to his followers. Now, in the 16th century, Catholic missionaries began appearing in Japan. First the Jesuits, then the Franciscans. They came together with Spanish and Portuguese merchants. And at first, they were actually successful in preaching. You may have heard of the Roman Catholic missionary, Francis Xavier, who preached all over the world. He ended up preaching in Japan. And actually, the Catholic missionaries converted many Japanese people, including some of the daimyo, including some of the feudal lords. But the trouble is that the Catholic missionaries, they were kind of mixing politics and religion. They wanted economic domination in the areas they were in Japan. And the shogun realized very early that the Portuguese and Spanish governments were kind of supporting the missionaries, and they knew what the Spanish and Portuguese colonialists had done in other countries, and they did not want that to happen in Japan. So the shogun banned Christianity in 1612. 1612, and he expelled all of the foreign clergy, but the persecution wasn't really that bad. They threw the Catholic clergy out. It wasn't so bad. But a few years later, in 1637, there was a Catholic rebellion. 30,000 Roman Catholics, seized a castle in the southern part of Japan, and they held out against the shogun's army. And it was specifically a religious rebellion. The banners that they carried into battle had the cross and pictures of the Virgin Mary and so on. But they were defeated by the shogun's army. The shogun realized that the Christians could be a real political threat, so he really cracked down hard on it. Many Japanese Christians were executed. Many were crucified. As a matter of fact, crucifixion, the Japanese had never practiced it. But one thing they learned about Christianity is, of course, that Jesus Christ was crucified. So they decided they wanted to crucify some of these missionaries and some of these Japanese Christians. So basically, but Christianity did not disappear in Japan. People practiced it secretly. There were a group of people who are called the hidden Christians. So from the early 17th century, they preserved the Catholic faith as well as they could. They had no priests, so the sacrament they had, of course, Catholic sacrament, was baptism. They would baptize their children from one generation to another. But the thing is, the Japanese really, really wanted to make sure that nobody was a Christian. So people had to prove they were Christian. If your parents had been Christian, if your grandparents had been Christian, you still had to prove that you weren't a Christian. And one of the ways they did that was, oh, actually, no, wrong one. I'm going the wrong way, Doreen? Tell me where do I go, Doreen? There we go. Okay, this is a metal plate. It's called the fumie, which means a picture you step on. And so Japanese Christians had to step on these plates to prove that they were not Christians. But many of these have been preserved, and the ones that are preserved in the museums, you'll find out that the sides here are very trampled down. The sides here are very, very flat. But they tried their best at the risk of their lives not to step on images of Christ or his mother. And the other thing is what they did is they made images that looked Buddhist. Like they have a Buddhist goddess carrying a little baby, and the Japanese didn't really know what it was. If it was a Buddhist thing, but it was actually Christ, the mother of God, and Christ. But these hidden Christians survived from the early 17th century into the 19th century. And so when Catholic missionaries came back in the 19th century, they revealed themselves. So, of course, I mean, they are Catholic, they're not Orthodox, but it's quite an example of preserving the Christian faith under fierce persecution. But what St. Nicholas took away from this is that the Orthodox mission would not become involved in politics. The Orthodox mission was going to be non-political. Now, again, in the 17th century, the shogun closed Japan. Japanese people could not leave Japan. Foreigners could not come into Japan. This is called Sakoku, the closed country period. Except there were a few Dutch merchants, a few Chinese merchants. But then 1853, 1854, the Russian Empire was expanding in the Pacific. The Americans were expanding in the Pacific. They wanted to do trade with Japan. When whaling ships needed to take on whatever supplies they needed, they wanted to be able to get supplies in Japan. If Russian or American sailors were marooned in Japan, they wanted to be treated well. So basically, the American fleet and the Russian fleet arrived and said, basically, open Japan to business and trade, or else. Now, at first, many of the Japanese were really, really opposed to opening up Japan. They did not want, because for the Japanese, Japan is a sacred land. It's the land of the gods. And so some of the Japanese samurai would take their swords and attack some foreigners. But basically, what the British especially did, they just moved their fleets in and bombarded, Japanese cities with their superior military technology, and just destroyed the city. So the Japanese had to give in, and so a few ports were open to foreign diplomats and to foreign merchants and so on. And Hakodate in the north was one of the ports open. I should say, again, Hakodate is the northernmost island in Japan. So Hokkaido was the northernmost island in Japan, so close to the closest to Russia, actually. So St. Nicholas got there. The council was there. Let's see. Okay, this is the original wooden council or church in Hakodate. It was built next to the Russian consulate. It was destroyed later. So this is the church in Hakodate. Now, St. Nicholas wanted to learn Japanese. He really, really did, because St. Innocent had told him that if you're going to be a missionary, you have to master the languages. But no one wanted to teach him. I mean, they knew he was a Christian priest. They knew he was a monk. The Japanese language teachers did not want to teach them. So at the beginning, actually, he got a little bit discouraged. And of course, the consulate had a library of books, Russian and other European languages that St. Nicholas could read. So he was kind of reading them. And then St. Innocent Veniaminov, on one of his trips from Alaska going to Russia, stopped in Hakodate, and he saw what St. Nicholas was doing. He said, throw those books out, throw them in the garbage. You have to master Japanese. Forget about, you have to master Japanese. Now, first of all, at this time, there were no textbooks of Japanese. Now, if you were in a language, you buy a textbook. These didn't exist at the time. But St. Nicholas decided he was going to learn Japanese. And his process of learning Japanese took 7 years, at least 7 years. He mastered not only the spoken language, but the various literary languages. When he found teachers, he hired 3 teachers at one point just to teach him almost around the clock. In addition to learning, he went to Buddhist temples to hear the Buddhist sermons. In Japan, there were storytellers on the street, and he would listen to the storytellers. So we really had this, he really attained a mastery of Japanese. He was a profound scholar of things Japanese, and he laid the foundation for Russian studies of Japan. And I should mention, going back to the Catholic missionaries in the 16th, 17th century, one of the Catholic missionaries said the Japanese language is the language of the devil. It was invented to prevent the preaching of the gospel, but St. Nicholas didn't feel that way. So there was a school teaching Japanese, and St. Nicholas wanted to go there. So he began attending the school, and the head of the school got really nervous because, again, Christianity was illegal at that time. So the teacher didn't want any trouble. So he had a foreign teacher there teaching English. And so the Japanese owner of the language school told the Englishmen, throw this Russian guy out. And when St. Nicholas came to the school, the English guy said, I'm going to throw you out on, I won't use a vulgar expression, I'm going to throw you out on you know what. Didn't bother him. He said, St. Nicholas said, you can beat me up. I'm coming to school. So that didn't work. The threat of violence didn't work. Then this language school put a little sign on the door, entrance forbidden to the Russian priest. So St. Nicholas went to the school. He took the sign down, put it in his pocket, and went in. The other thing about St. Nicholas, at one point, he really wanted to learn everything. And so when he would visited one of his language teachers in the man's house, he would go into the kitchen and he talked to the man's wife, the teacher's wife, saying, "What is this? What is this vegetable? What is that fruit? What is this spoon? What is that fork?" So he really wanted to gain a mystery. Okay. Now, and it says actually he drove this woman crazy asking about the vegetables and the fruit. Now, I entitled this presentation, "The Saint and the Samurai." I'm sure everybody knows a samurai is a Japanese warrior. And the reason is entitled this, is this man. Okay, this man, Sawabe Takuma, was a Japanese samurai. He was also a priest in a Shinto temple, the native religion of Japan, and he was a teacher of fencing. I don't mean fencing with foils. I mean fencing with real swords. And so Gushkevich, the Russian consul, wanted to have his son learn Japanese fencing. So Abe was hard. He would go to the consulate, and whenever he'd pass St. Nicholas in the hall, he always gave him a really dirty look. Now, and there are a couple of variations of the story. One variation is that one day Sawabe burst into St. Nicholas's room with his hand on his sword, looking for trouble. The other is that he was just glaring at him. But St. Nicholas said, "Well, why do you hate me so much? What have I ever done to you?" And Sawabe said, "You're coming to take over our country. Your religion is going to destroy our religion. Your country is going to take over our country." So St. Nicholas said, "Well, look, you're a samurai. You're an honorable man. Is it honorable to kill a man before you know what he teaches, before you know what he believes?" And Sawabe said, "No, I guess that's not honorable." So St. Nicholas began to talk to him about orthodoxy. He became interested. And in his long kimono sleeve, he had a little notebook he was taking notes. And he began to come back to listen to St. Nicholas. Now, the funny thing is, he was a Shinto priest. This is the way he earned his living. But in the Shinto temple, the Shinto shrine in which he served, the language that they're using in the Shinto services is 100%, 1,000% unlike modern Japanese. I mean, it's not even like the Slavonic Russian thing, no comparison. So that when the Japanese would hear him chanting, they would have no idea what he was chanting. So Sawabe got a Chinese New Testament because educated Japanese could read Chinese. So while he's doing his Shinto service, ringing his little bell there, he's reading from the New Testament in Chinese. And nobody noticed. There were also some friends of his, a man named Sakai and a man named Urano. They were friends, and they began to listen to St. Nicholas's, his preaching about orthodoxy, and so they decided they wanted to be baptized. Remember, Christianity is illegal in Japan. Foreigners came there; they weren't going to harm the foreigners, but if any Japanese converted to Christianity, they would be killed. They would simply be killed. But Sawabe, Sakai, and Urano wanted to be baptized, so St. Nicholas took them to the church at the consulate, closed the windows, closed the doors, pulled down the shades, and he baptized and chrismated them as Pavel Sawabe, Yohan Sakai, and Yakov Urano. So that was the beginning of the Orthodox. That was the beginning of the Orthodox mission. And of course, now at this point, Sawabe was a baptized Orthodox Christian. Obviously, he couldn't continue serving in a Shinto shrine, and so he left, which caused great consternation. His wife actually burned the family house down in annoyance. Okay, so now we're up to 1868. As I said, Japan was nominally under the rule of the emperor, in fact, under the rule of the shogun, the military leader. In 1868, a coalition of Japanese feudal clans basically overthrew the shogun and restored the emperor to his throne. And this is called the Meiji Restoration. Meiji was the name of the Japanese emperor in question. And so now Japan was becoming much more open to the world. And there was, even though Christianity was still illegal, there was a great interest in Christianity. So, not only people interested in Orthodoxy, but worrying about Catholicism and Protestantism and so on. So at this point, St. Nicholas realized it's time to begin a real mission in Japan, not just as a consular chaplain. But in 1869, he returned to Russia to get recognition for a mission, establishing a missionary society. He raised money. And again, being very, very practical, he brought back a lithography machine from Russia to Japan so he could print religious booklets and so on. He brought icons and books and so on. And during the St. Nicholas's absence in Russia, Sawabe, Sakai, and Urano were actually preaching orthodoxy themselves. I mean, these were recent converts. They had only recently been chrismated. They did not know that much about orthodoxy, but they were so much on fire for their faith, they were preaching it. Okay, so St. Nicholas was back in Japan in 1871, and he decided to leave his successor. No, he's not here. Okay. Father Anatoly Tikai. He was left as the priest in charge of the consular church in Hakodate, and St. Nicholas moved to Tokyo, which of course was the new capital of Japan, as it still is, Tokyo. And at that time, the places where foreigners could live in Tokyo was very, very restricted. And this is a neighborhood called Tsukiji, which is one of the neighborhoods of Tokyo. And all the foreigners live there. As you can see, the buildings here are foreign-style buildings. These are not Japanese-style buildings. Tsukiji actually now is the site of one of the biggest fish markets in the world. That's his claim to fame right now. But that's where he lived. But he wanted to begin preaching, so he just rented a little room. And St. Nicholas was a tall man. I forget how exactly tall he was. And Japanese rooms are really small. And I'm 6'3", so in Japan I was banging my head on doors all the time. St. Nicholas had the same problem. But he was collecting people and preaching orthodoxy to them. And actually, at that time, early on, he was noticed by the Japanese government as a man who could speak Japanese, spoke Russian, spoke several European languages. So actually, in 1872, the Russian Grand Duke Alexander was on a visit to Japan, and St. Nicholas acted as an interpreter for part of the conversation between the Russian Grand Duke and the Japanese nobility. He also arranged for the sons of some important Japanese to study in Russian. Now, 1863, Christianity was legalized. However, it was, I'm sorry, before it was legalized in 1873, Christians were still in jail, were still put in jail. Sawabe spent some time in a Japanese jail, actually. So St. Nicholas is in Tokyo, and he's renting a small room in the foreign settlement of Tsukiji, but he had a grand vision. Okay, let's see. No, Dreen is the picture of the cathedral. Okay, there was a hill in Tokyo, a rather high hill called Surugadai, which is where the cathedral is now. It's a rather high hill and it kind of overlooks Tokyo, and it belonged to a former feudal lord. So St. Nicholas raised the money and he bought this property because he knew he wanted to have this mission right in the heart of Tokyo. He wanted people to be able to see. So let me see the dates. Oh, I should say, the actual title of the cathedral is Holy Resurrection Cathedral. Everybody in Japan calls it Nikoraido. Nikolai being Nicholas, of course, Nikolai. Do is a Japanese word meaning like temple, church, hall, or whatever the important public building. So in the Japanese mind, Orthodox is so identified with Nikolai, they call it Nikolaido. So if you ever go to Japan, and I'm not exaggerating, if you get in a taxi in Tokyo and you say Nikolaido, they know just where to go. I mean, everybody has that experience there. So so this is the beginning of the construction of the cathedral. He raised money in Japan and in Russia, and the design was done by a Russian architect, Shichirpov. Forgive me the Russian again. It was he wrote the blueprints and everything. And it was actually an English architect resident in Japan who actually built it. So the construction started in 1884 and continued. It was finished in 1891. So this is it under construction. Okay, now this is Tokyo. And it has a laser pointer. I don't have to point with my fingers, do I? Okay, this is Tokyo. You can see it's all flat, right? And this is Nikolaido. Well, the thing is, Nicolino overlooked the Imperial Palace. From standing on the bell tower, you could look down on the emperor. And a lot of Japanese nationalists did not like that. They thought it was an actual affront and an insult to the Japanese emperor. And people, of course, threatened St. Nicholas, but he didn't care. So the cathedral was built. It was consecrated in 1891 with many clergy, guests. It's interesting, he invited the diplomats from most of the nations that had, embassies in Tokyo at that time, and none of the Catholic diplomats came, actually. The Protestant diplomats came, but the Catholics did not. St. Nicholas did not, he didn't like Catholics at all. Okay. This is the library early on. As you can see, it's quite an extensive library. Unfortunately, in 1923, there was a major earthquake in Japan, which damaged Nicolino. The library burned down. But it contained books in Russian, of course, in Japanese, in Chinese, and other European languages, because he wanted to make sure that his priests were multilingual. And the thing is, right from the beginning, St. Nicholas he was totally clear in his own mind. He was not establishing the Russian Orthodox Church in Japan. He was establishing the Japanese Orthodox Church, which means he needed Japanese clergy as soon as possible. In addition to training clergy, he also used catechists. These were lay people that were not ordained, but they went through a course of studies and were sent out to preach. So right from the beginning, the goal was to have a native clergy, and of course the services in Japanese. So in addition to the seminary, there was a catechist's school. Interesting, in 1891, at the time the Tsarevich, now St. Nicholas, the Tsar martyr, visited Japan. It was supposed to be a friendship journey between Japan and Russia. And they tried to show St. Nicholas the martyr, the royal martyr, the good side of Japan. But at one point he was passing through a town, and some Japanese policeman who didn't like foreigners took out his sword and he hit the Tsarevich in his head with his sword. Prince George of Greece, who was a relative of the Romanovs, had a cane and he kind of prevented the damage. And so, the Japanese were really scared. They thought this was going to be an international incident, that the Russians were going to invade. They were sure of that. So St. Nicholas got on the first train from Tokyo, which is the eastern part of Japan, went down to Kobe, the harbor where the Tsarevich was on the Russian ship, with profuse apologies from the Japanese, the emperor. And so nothing came of it then. But I have to say, St. Nicholas, the Tsar, the royal martyr, had a rather negative view of Japan from that time. So anyway, during the 1870s, the mission is expanding. There were missions in Tokyo, in Osaka, another large city in western Japan, and especially in the north. And if you remember, a couple years ago, there was a major earthquake in Japan, the earthquake and the tsunami, which destroyed the northeastern part of Japan. That's the part of Japan where most of the Orthodox parishes are located. Some of the parishes were damaged, none beyond repair. But that area is where the Orthodox are primarily. Okay. So he wanted Japanese priests. So in 1874, Bishop Pavel of Eastern Siberia ordained Pavel Sawabe to the priesthood, and others to the priesthood and the diaconate. Now, okay, this is bell ringing. Again, this is the pre-1923 cathedral, and they have nice bells actually. Now, Father Anatoly Tikai was, as I said, St. Nicholas' successor as the priest in the consulate. His brother was a musician, and he was brought to Japan in order to teach Orthodox church music to the Japanese, and he did a really good job of that. So there were several Russian conductors, and of course, obviously, Slavonic and Japanese are two very, very different languages. So St. Nicholas had to translate the text from Slavonic first, but then these musicians had to set it to music, and it's a difficult task. I am not musical, so I cannot give you any examples, but my wife in the back there, she attended the summer music school here a few years ago, and for her graduation piece, she taught the other students the Bortnyansky in Japanese. So there was sung here at Jordanville in Japanese at one point. No, and so the thing is that St. Nicholas really paid a lot of attention to music and to the liturgy. He wanted the music sung correctly, he wanted the priest to serve correctly, and so on. And the cathedral, Nicolaido, is in the center of a university district in Tokyo. And so students would often come there. And it was one of the first places where Japanese could hear Western music being sung. And so, from 1891 until the present day, people come and listen to the choir at Nicolaido, and that's something that draws people into Orthodoxy, as a matter of fact. Now, in 1879, St. Nicholas returned to Russia, where he was consecrated as a bishop. At that time, he met Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky knew of St. Nicholas's activities in Japan, and St. Nicholas was a great admirer of Dostoevsky, so they had a chance to meet at that time. Okay, now this is the publication office. I mean, St. Nicholas wanted as much stuff in Japanese as soon as possible, so he had a whole staff. The liturgical text he translated himself with a Japanese helper. But some of the Japanese priests had learned Russian by this time, so they could help to a certain extent in the translation activities. So in the 1890s and 1880s and 90s, there were several different newspapers and magazines published by the Japanese Orthodox Mission. Then there was a Japanese woman. Her name before she was baptized was Yamashita Rin. Rin, do we have her here? Okay. So she was sent by St. Nicholas. She was an artist. She was one of the first Japanese women to wanted to study Western art. And so she was sent by St. Nicholas to St. Petersburg, to where, Mary? Novodevichy? Yeah. To the icon study there, where she studied iconography. Now, I mean, her iconography is actually quite Western, I have to say that. But as one of the first Japanese women or Japanese people to paint in a Western manner, her work is now considered a national treasure. So this is one of her icons, and the churches that have them in Japan are quite proud of having those icons, actually. Also, the best students who graduated from the seminary in Tokyo were sent to Russia to study. Now, St. Nicholas had many acquaintances among the non-Orthodox missionaries. He was friendly with non-Orthodox missionaries, but not with Catholics. I mean, the Catholics were really trying to undermine, they really tried to undermine the work of the Orthodox mission. They would tell the Japanese that the Tsar was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, and it's not a real church. But he was friendly with some of the Protestants, especially some of the Anglican Episcopalians. And this may sound strange that an Orthodox bishop would be friends with Episcopalians, but this is 120 years ago, and presumably they were more Orthodox than they are now. But also among these students at the seminary and who went to Russia to study, they began the first translations of Russian literature into Japanese. So again, the students of the seminary, some who didn't become priests, really were laying the foundations for Russian literature in Japan. Okay. Okay, this is St. Nicholas translating. St. Nicholas sat at his desk from roughly 6 o'clock every night to 10 or 11 o'clock every night for 30 years. For 30 years he did this, sitting side by side with this man named Pavel Nakai. Of course, if there was a vigil or something, that would be interrupted, but he translated and translated and translated. And the thing is, this Nakai was a scholar of Japanese, which is why St. Nicholas used. And St. Nicholas would revise his translations from time to time. This is an example of a handwritten translation from Slavonic into Japanese. And he revised things many, many times because he wanted them just perfect. But when he was translating, he used the Slavonic text. He said that the Slavonic text was more faithful to the Greek original rather than the Russian. He also consulted the Greek and he consulted the Latin. But for example, and also he referred to St. John Chrysostom's commentaries when translating. He said it would take about 5 hours to translate 15 verses. So you can imagine how long that took. So he was one of the great translators in Japanese history. But the kind of language that he uses was a literary language, not the spoken language, which was fine because books that were printed in the literary language. So any book in Japan that was printed prior to 1945 was a literary language. but now that they don't publish books that way. People learn to study the literary language. So actually, some people compare the liturgical Japanese to the modern Japanese as the difference between Slavonic and Russian. And actually, it's not a fair comparison because in Russia, in primary schools, as far as I know, they're not teaching Church Slavonic. But in Japan, in order to be a literate Japanese, you have to be able to read this literary Japanese. So they all study it from elementary school through college. So when they see the St. Nicholas's translations, they understand them. When they hear them, they might be a little bit confused at first. When they see them, it's quite clear. And actually, the Protestants and the Catholics continued using these kinds of translations into the 1980s. Um, Okay, and all St. Nicholas translated all the service books of the Orthodox Church. I think it's probably safe to say that there's a bigger set of translations of the liturgical books of the Orthodox Church in Japanese than there is in English. You can just buy the liturgical books, and there they go. You have everything. You don't have to collect photostats from here, there, and other place. He really did a marvelous job. But see, the trouble was translating. You had to avoid using Buddhist or Shinto language. So Buddha is not God. When you say the Japanese word for God is kami, but the Japanese are thousands, tens of thousands of gods. So it took a bit of effort to get the right word. He was very, very careful about that. So, for example, the Buddhists talk about nirvana. Nirvana is blankness, emptiness. Obviously, that wouldn't be an appropriate word for the Christian concept of heaven. Now, one of St. Nicholas's most difficult things was attracting other Russian missionaries. He brought people over. Some people stayed for a little while. Some people stayed for longer. Two people whom you will know as missionaries in Japan is that at the time Archimandrite Sergei Stragorotsky, the future patriarch, was a missionary in Japan for a while, and Saint Andronik, whom you know, Saint Andronik Nikolsky, who was the first bishop of Kyoto in Japan. But St. Nicholas was very demanding of his missionaries. Among other things, he said, if I'm not mistaken, he told the missionaries you had to donate, I think, a third of your salary back to the mission to support the mission. And not all the missionaries liked that. But the longest term missionary was Sergei Tikhomirov. He came to Japan. I don't have the exact date, before 1912, and he guided the Japanese Orthodox Church up from the death of Saint Nicholas up until 1945. Now, what do we have here? Okay, all right, this is Sunday morning at Nicolaido, actually. But the thing is, St. Nicholas was a great man. But in my opinion, in my thesis, I entitled the chapter about the Russo-Japanese War as his finest hour. Because you have to realize in the early part of the 20th century, the Russian empires and the Japanese empire, were moving on a collision course in Manchuria and in Korea. So war was coming. And at that time, there was a tremendous slander campaign about the Japanese Orthodox Church. Again, saying that the head of the Japanese Orthodox Church is the Russian Tsar. The Orthodox are Russian spies. So in the media, the newspapers and everything, he was constantly attacked. There were mass demonstrations against the Orthodox Church. Now, prior to 1904, prior to the beginning of war, the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, the Russian ambassador in Tokyo said, "Look, war's coming. We're going to evacuate all the Russian citizens from Japan." And St. Nicholas said, "I can't abandon my flock. These are my people. I'm staying here." And he said, "You might be killed. Well, I'm going to stay here." So first of all, before the war came, when he told the Japanese Orthodox Christians, he says, "You are not Russian Orthodox. You're Japanese Orthodox. You don't owe political allegiance to the Tsar." He said, "You can fight for your country." St. Nicholas was a strong patriot, and he believed in patriotism. So he told the Japanese Orthodox to pray for the victory of their country, but to fight not out of hatred for the Russians, but out of a love for Japan and out of love for their emperor. And so he really resolved a difficult crisis of conscience for the Japanese Orthodox, because many of them had been to seminary in Russia. They did speak Russian, But anyway, so he decided to stay. But what he did, though, he no longer attended services at the cathedral at Nicolaido, because of course they were praying for the victory of the Japanese empire. And so Nicholas said, "Well, I'm a Russian patriot. I'm not going to pray for the victory of Japan." So he just celebrated services in his private chapel in the bishop's bishop's residence. However, the Japanese government wanted this was Japan's really first entry into the world scene as a major military power. And what the Japanese government wanted to be very clear about, that this was not a Buddhist Christian war. It's not the Christians against the heathens. They really wanted to avoid that. So they really did bend over backwards to protect St. Nicholas. I mean, if people tried to assault an Orthodox church, an Orthodox priest, the police were right there. Okay. Okay. And of course, with as a result of military action in Manchuria, in Korea, on the sea, there were many Russian prisoners of war. Okay, there were many Russian prisoners of war in Japan, and so when the Russian POWs came, really the emphasis of the mission was focused on the POWs. So priests that could speak Russian were sent to the prison camps, to conduct services, to hear confessions, and so on. St. Nicholas sent books to the Russian POWs. He really tried to take care of them as best as he could. And of course, many of the POWs died in captivity. Not that they were ill-treated, but many of them died of their wounds, and they were buried in Japan. And the Japanese Orthodox Church to this day makes a very special point of celebrating panahidas at the Russian war graves. This is a contemporary photo from the church in Nagoya, which is kind of in the middle of Japan, of a panahida at Russian war graves. And actually, the Russian POWs were so grateful to St. Nicholas's help during the mission. After they returned to Russia, they contributed money to build a church. They actually built a whole. Okay, this is a. Dream, where exactly is the church? Middle right. Okay. The Russian what? Where am I going? There it is. Yeah, that's it. Okay, the Russian POWs donated money to erect that church in that city. Okay. Now, this is one of my favorite stories. The Japanese and the Russians signed the peace treaty through the good offices of President Theodore Roosevelt. This is called the Treaty of Portsmouth because it was signed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Now, in the Japanese mind, they had defeated the Russian Empire. In the Russian mind, they hadn't, because the Japanese is a small country with not that many soldiers, not that many ships, and the Russian Empire, of course, had millions and millions and millions of men. So in the Russian mind, they really hadn't quite lost. And so they didn't want to give concessions to the Japanese. The Japanese wanted a lot of money. They wanted all sorts of things, and they didn't get it in the peace treaty. And when the Japanese learned about the peace treaty, they rioted. And the Japanese don't riot. They're kind of a placid people. But they rioted, and they rioted in a park, which is not too far from Nicolaido. And so they marched en masse, thousands of people. And actually, they were burning police stations, attacking police officers. Newspapers that supported the treaty were being attacked. So they were marching on Nicolaido to destroy it. And just at the time, as they were actually getting to Nicolaido, and they were lighting the fences outside the cathedral on fire, the Japanese emperor had heard that this was happening, that this mob was moving there. So the Japanese emperor actually sent the Imperial Guard cavalry to defend Nicolaido. And this is, an example of literally, the cavalry saving the day, just in the nick of time. But the funny thing is, St. Nicholas told the students in the seminary, the students in the girls' school to kind of hide together in a central room. But with this mob surrounding the cathedral, wanting his death, he went up on the third floor veranda, and he just looked at him. And the Japanese cavalry said, get down, so he's going to shoot you or something. He just watched it very, very peacefully, actually. Okay. Now, so St. Nicholas began developing heart problems in 1910, and he served his last liturgy on Christmas of 1911. And he was sent to the hospital. He had serious heart trouble, but he didn't want to stay in the hospital. He said, the translation work is not done. I haven't translated all the books of the Old Testament. I have to get back to Nicolaido to translate. So he went back, and he was he continued translating. He continued translating right up until the end. Now, the thing is, there are two actually contradictory stories of his death. Metropolitan Sergei Tikhomirov wrote kind of like a day-by-day diary of the last days of St. Nicholas. And Metropolitan Sergius said that he died peacefully in his sleep. But there's another story. In 1972, after St. Nicholas was canonized, in the Japanese Orthodox Church, they published a Slavonic Akathist and a short saint's life of St. Nicholas. And I can't track down the sources for this life, so I don't know what the sources are. But according to this, when St. Nicholas was in his room, the choir was practicing, relatively close, and so somebody said to the choir, you should be quiet. St. Nicholas, Nicholas, the bishop is very, very sick. He's dying, and St. Nicholas told whoever that was, said, don't tell him, not to sing. I enjoy hearing the singing right now. And what he actually asked them, he asked them to sing by the waters of Babylon, which is as he was dying. Now, according to this life from Tokyo, this, as you see, this is on his deathbed. According to the life from Tokyo, which I cannot trust I can't trace the sources. His last word was resurrection, Vostosenia, and that's how he died. So I can't guarantee that's the whole story, but there. Okay. Now the thing is, when he died, with a big, there were bishops, there were priests, there were diplomats at Nicolaido, and they had a long procession to the cemetery where he was buried. This is the funeral at Nicolaido. Okay, and this is a procession going from the cathedral to the cemetery. How long would you say? It must have taken 45 minutes or an hour at least to get there. Okay, now this is a wreath sent by the Japanese emperor, the Emperor Meiji. The thing is, the emperor did not do this for foreigners in Japan, send these kind of wreaths. He realized the contribution that St. Nicholas had made. And so he sent this, a high honor. Okay, a high honor. And the thing is, so in the cemetery called Yanaka, St. Nicholas is buried there, Metropolitan Sergei Tikhomirov is there, Metropolitan Theodosius Nagashima is there. But St. Nicholas was canonized. The Japanese Orthodox Church said, we want to remove his relics from the cemetery and move them to Nicolaido, where we can establish a chapel for him. And the Japanese government said no. They said, Nikolai doesn't belong just to you, he belongs to all of Japan. So they took a portion of the relics. There is a chapel there now. They're trying to start a monastery with that chapel. But so some of the relics are there, but he lies in this particular seminary. Now this is his handwriting. As you can see, it's from the letter of the Corinthians. Now, at the time of St. Nicholas's death in 1912, the statistics say that there were 33,000 believers, 32 priests, 96 churches, and 265 chapels. Now, I have to realize something. At one point, I don't remember the exact year, there were more Orthodox Christians in Japan than Catholic Christians. You have to remember that. The Catholics had all the money, not only from the Vatican, but the French government, the Italian government, everybody's government, funding all these Catholic missionaries. And there was St. Nicholas with some of the Russian priests who came and helped, and the Japanese priests who helped, who actually converted more people. It's incredible what he was able to do. And so he died in 1912. After his death, bishop at the time, Sergei Tikhomirov, took over. Now, the thing is, you have to understand the Japanese Orthodox Church was receiving a lot of financial help from Russia. When the Russian Revolution came, the money stopped. Now, they had to cut down on expenses. They closed the catechist school. They closed some of the publication department. So Metropolitan Sergius had to kind of help the transition between help from Russia, and the church being financially independent. So that's what he did. But in 1923, there was an earthquake. You can see this was the bell tower. This is gone. The dome fell in. There was a major fire in there. So 1923, and this is when the library burned. Everything burned. Everything burned. Now, again, the Japanese Orthodox Church in the 1920s, even if we're talking about 30,000 people, it's relatively small. But Metropolitan Sergius traveled all over Japan, raising money. And for the Japanese Orthodox, Nicolaido is a symbol of orthodoxy. So with whatever money they could save and contribute, they rebuilt it. So this is the contemporary. Is this one of our pictures, Doreen? Okay, this is when we were there. So you see the bell tower is much lower. You can't really see the dome, but the interior is a little bit changed too. But the Japanese Christians were willing to take their money and rebuild that church. Now, going through the 1930s and into World War II, of course, the Japanese were going on a war path. They were going to fight, America and England and China and everybody else. And this time around, they didn't worry about offending Christians. So there was a real kind of harassment, not only of Orthodox Christians, but of all Christians in Japan. Now, Metropolitan Sergius guided the flock during this period, but late in the war, 1905, 1945, he was arrested and put in prison. And there are two stories. One story is he died shortly after being released from prison because of his ill treatment, because the Japanese were terribly cruel to the prisoners of war or anybody like that. That's one story. The other story is that he was poisoned in prison, but I can't verify that story. Okay, now we get to 1945, at the end of the war. The Americans occupied Japan. Now the thing is, the Soviets, I should say, wanted to get their part of Japan. They wanted to cut up Japan the way they cut up Germany, for example, Soviet sector, British, and MacArthur didn't want that. Okay, but the Moscow Patriarchate wanted to send one of its bishops. They actually put a bishop on the plane to send him to Japan to take over the Japanese church. Oddly enough, on MacArthur's staff, one of his intelligence officers was a Colonel Posh. Can't think of his first name, Colonel Posh. And Posh was short for Pashkovsky, who was Orthodox. So, and he knew the situation. He knew the Soviets, he knew what the Soviets wanted to do. So basically, with the help of General MacArthur, the Japanese Orthodox Church was put under the auspices of the Metropolia from 1945 on. But it prevented the Soviets from getting their hands on it. And then when the OCA received its autocephaly from Moscow, the Japanese Orthodox Church received its autonomy, and so the Japanese Orthodox Church is an autonomous church within the Russian Orthodox Church. Now again, I'm just offering some of my personal viewpoints here. He wanted to create a native orthodoxy, just as St. Innocent created a native, and St. Herman, of course, created a native orthodoxy in Alaska, which has survived all these years, survived even, let's face it, Protestant persecution in Alaska. The Japanese Orthodox Church made it to the Russian Revolution, through World War II, and survives. And the fact that he prepared Japanese clergy, they were ready to take over. I mean, they lived on practically nothing, but they were willing to take over and run the church. And when it comes to, now, I should say this, these days it's very fashionable to criticize missionaries. They say that missionaries go to foreign countries and destroy the local culture. But that's not the case. But with the Alaskan missionaries and in Japan, St. Nicholas respected the native culture, tried to not adapt Orthodoxy, of course not, but he wanted to make it Japanese, and he really, really did, I think. He really, really did. And so he simply was not political. As I said, he viewed the problems that the Catholic missions had because of their involvement with politics, and he avoided that. Because he avoided that. And again, as we all know, Saint Innocent Veniaminov, in addition to learning several native languages, of course, invented alphabets for languages that hadn't been written. Saint Nicholas didn't do that. Japan was a very literate country. But just as Saint Innocent laid the foundations for a lot of Alaskan studies, Saint Nicholas did the same thing for Japan. And so, 31 years ago, actually, oddly enough, Japan has more English language daily newspapers than New York does in Tokyo, which is odd, but they do. And I happened to I had been thinking of becoming Orthodox before, even in this country, but I hadn't quite made it. And I opened up the Japan Times. They had an advertisement for Nicolaido, for the Orthodox Church. So I called, and I got an answer, somebody speaking English to me, which is quite providential. Turned out it was a Father John Takahashi, who had gone to St. Vladimir Seminary, spoke English fluently. His wife was an American, his Machishka was an American. So I went to Nicolaido, and there was a group of foreigners there who were parishioners there. So I made friends, and I became Orthodox in Japan 31 years ago. And then when I went back, after graduating from St. Vladimir's, when I went back, I guess, 89, 90, I was teaching English at a university there, but I was also serving I was also serving as a priest at Nicolaido. And only, I mean, I've only actually done the vigil and the liturgy one time in Japanese, and I certainly could not do it now in Japanese. But I went to one of the village churches kind of outside of Tokyo, and I mean, the orthodoxy that St. Nicholas planted there so long ago is still there. I mean, they love their priests. They respect their priests. They support their priest. But the lay people, I think, really have a sense of that I don't want to say they own the church. That's a bad way of putting it, but it's their church. It's their church. And so there's a very good chance if your great-great-grandparents were converted by St. Nicholas in 1870 or 1880, the great-great-grandchildren will be Orthodox today. Because to become Christian in Japan is difficult. It's hard. Because Buddhism and Shinto are so woven together with Japanese culture that if you, like for example, they have festivals in Japan. Where they carry the Shinto gods on shrines through the streets. Well, the merchants on the streets are supposed to contribute money to these festivals, and the Christian merchants won't. They say we're not going to contribute money to the worshiping of a pagan god. So they're ostracized for that. And then once you actually become Christian in Japan, even for Protestants and Catholics, I have to say, I mean, you've made a decisive step which you can't go back from. And so they are very, very loyal, and they love St. Nicholas just as the native Alaskans, as the Alaskans love St. Herman and St. Innocent, the Japanese Orthodox love St. Nicholas. So as I was mentioning earlier, I mean, I've given this talk in other places. This is the most formal situation I've given it in, so this is kind of still a work in progress, and I'm sure I will hear, certainly from my wife, perhaps from Mary over there, things I could have said or should have said. So let me stop now and ask if there are any questions, if that's all right, okay? Are there any questions? Mary has a question, okay. She knows as much as I do, so go ahead.
Can you talk a little bit about his diaries?
Oh, the diaries, okay. Okay, I didn't mention the diaries, that's not in there, good point, Mary. Okay, at the earthquake in 1923, the library burned, and St. Nicholas had been a diary writer from a young age. So it was assumed that those diaries had been destroyed in the fire. Nobody knew that, but nobody knew what had happened for sure. There's a Japanese professor, his name is Nakamura, who I don't think is Orthodox, maybe not even a Christian, but he's a professor of Russian Slavic studies, and he's devoted his life to writing about St. Nicholas. And he was at the time, Leningrad, in one of the state archives, and he actually found the diaries of St. Nicholas. I mean, some of them are missing. It's not the whole thing, but in Russian, they consist of 5 large volumes. So a team of scholars, Japanese and Russian, worked on producing the diaries and printing them. They were printed in St. Petersburg a few years ago. And I mean, they're in Russian. I mean, they're kind of hard to obtain in this country, but they exist, or the smaller books exist. And it really shows the inner workings of the mind of a saint. I mean, what he actually thought, and he didn't, obviously he didn't think he was a saint. He wasn't planning to become a saint. He was just doing his job. But the diaries are fascinating. So they're published in a 5-volume edition in Russia. They're published, I think, in at least a 5-volume edition in translation into Japanese. And they're good sellers. I mean, so they're quite fascinating. Anything else? Yes. Smolensk province, Berioza. I'm sorry, yes. Where was he born? Smolensk province, in a village called Berioza. Forgive the Russian, Berioza, I think, right, Mary? Okay, it's Smolensk. I mean, the village is no longer there, as far, but I believe they've erected a memorial cross. Like, in Smolensk, and he went to the Smolensk seminary. So yes. Yes. Well, monasteries, no. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. One of St. Nicholas, what? Oh, yes. Are there monasteries and seminaries? What about the situation? There is a seminary in Tokyo now. During the period when the Japanese church was under the Metropolia, Japanese seminarians went to St. Vladimir's or St. Chico's. So even now, a lot of the Japanese clergy can speak English. Now there is a seminary in Tokyo, which is where Japanese priests go to be trained. Now, one of St. Nicholas's great goals was to establish monastic life in Japan. He bought property, and somehow it just never took off. There was a Japanese man he tonsured as a monk. I'm not sure what happened to him. But now, at Nicolaido itself, to the right of the cathedral, there's a chapel with some of the relics of St. Nicholas there. Right now, there is a monk from Russia. I can't think of what monastery he's from, who's trying to start a monastic brotherhood based on that, on that chapel. They've expanded it now. It's not just a little chapel. And so he goes around Japan lecturing on monasticism. And also, Japanese people often go on pilgrimage to Russia. They really do, and they love the monasteries there. So on the part of the Japanese Orthodox Church, I think on the part of the Russian Orthodox Church, they want to give monastic life a little bit of a shove, a little bit of a kickstart, and hopefully that will take place. So that's monasticism. Yes. When he was riding in a rickshaw, one of these carriages, and there were police. What happened to the Tsar? The Tsarevich. That's the question. What happened to the Tsarevich? He was riding in a rickshaw, and the Japanese police were lined up along the side of the road to protect him. But suddenly, one of these Japanese policemen drew his sword, and he aimed a sword cut at the Tsarevich's forehead. And the thing is, a Japanese samurai sword can cut through steel. And if the blow had landed, he would have been killed. But Prince George of Greece, who was related to the Romanovs, was riding in the same carriage with him. And George had kind of like a cane or a stick. He raised it and he deflected the blow. So the Tsarevich got a wound on his forehead, but it wasn't life-threatening. So that's what happened. Yes.
Piece of clothing inside his
Mm-hmm.
wound. It's kept somewhere in somebody else here.
Oh, really?
As a relic.
That I did not know. That I did.
In fact, it was used for the checking.
Interesting. I did not know that. Okay.
Some Chinese church in St. Petersburg.
Huh. Well, any other questions? Okay. I mean, I just want to make sure there are no other questions. Okay. Let me, if someone who was less technologically challenged than I am, we have the CD of some of the music for the Japanese Orthodox Church, so we can just end with listening to that if that's all right. Father Deacon? So you just press the button. I press the button. I don't want to, get launched into space.
I think that will bring our lecture to a conclusion. Please, thank you, Father.
You're welcome.
Father John, it's absolutely wonderful.
So it's a work in progress, so thank you for being patient.